A boy disappeared during a class hike in the Smoky Mountains. Park rangers and volunteers searched for months but found nothing. Then, his lunchbox was found 15 years later with a note inside that said, "Still here." The metal detector shrieked, a high, insistent whine that sliced through the quiet hum of the Smoky Mountains, unearthing a child's lunchbox from beneath 15 years of settled earth, compacted soil, and the slow, relentless accumulation of fallen leaves. It was faded blue, the plastic scarred and brittle but miraculously intact, the cartoon characters on its lid barely visible beneath a patina of grime and time, the same faded blue, the exact same smiling, now ghostly spaceman that Ethan had clutched so tightly, his small knuckles white that crisp autumn morning he walked into the whispering trees and never, ever walked out. The hobbyist, a man whose weekends were typically measured in Revolutionary War buttons and corroded coins, felt a chill creep up his spine, wholly unrelated to the mountain air, a sudden, unwelcome premonition that this was no ordinary find, no discarded relic of a forgotten picnic. He pried open the rusted clasps with a trembling care he usually reserved for delicate artifacts, his breath catching in his throat. Inside, nestled against the discolored plastic, lay the spectral, almost powdered outline of a long-rotted sandwich, an apple turned to a shrunken, mummified lump, and a child's crayon sketch, surprisingly preserved, depicting a dark, sunless cave, its entrance a jagged maw against a crudely drawn cliff face. And beneath that sketch, clinging to the bottom of the lunchbox with an adhesive that had defied years of subterranean damp, lay a single yellowed sticky note, its edges curled like ancient parchment. Upon it, scrawled in the uneven, blocky letters of a young child, or perhaps someone mimicking a child, were two words, a chilling whisper resurrected from the silent earth, a message that resonated with an impossible, horrifying immediacy: still here. The discovery rippled outward, first to the park rangers, their faces grim with a remembered sorrow, then to the local sheriff's department, where old files, thick with dust and dead ends, were reluctantly pulled from deep storage, and finally, inevitably, it reached him, the father, a man whose life had bifurcated 15 years ago into a before Ethan and an aching, desolate after. He was a different man now, no longer the hopeful young parent who had waved goodbye at the trailhead, but someone harder, weathered, his eyes holding the endless, watchful patience of the wild places he now inhabited, a self-made survivalist forged in the crucible of unimaginable loss and the desperate flickering ember of a hope he could never fully extinguish. The news of the lunchbox, the description of its contents, the impossible, heart-stopping words on that note, did not bring tears, not at first. Grief had hollowed out that well long ago. Instead, a terrible cold clarity settled over him, the sharpening of senses he'd honed over a decade and a half of searching, not for a body anymore, but for an answer, any answer, to the silence that had swallowed his son whole. He saw the faded blue, the ghostly spaceman, Ethan's favorite, and the cave, a place Ethan had chattered about endlessly after a school lesson on geology, his imagination alight with secret worlds beneath their feet. Still here. The words were a brand, a promise, a threat, a cry. He had to go back. He had to know. The return to the Smoky Mountains was a pilgrimage into a past he had never truly left, each familiar curve of the road, each towering sentinel of pine and oak, a fresh stab of memory. 15 years. An eternity for a lost child, a lifetime of grief for a searching parent. He was lean, sinewed, his face a roadmap of wind and sun and sorrow, his hands calloused from axe and rope and the unforgiving earth. He moved with the quiet economy of a creature born to the wilderness, his pack containing not the hopeful supplies of a rescuer anymore, but the grim necessities of a man prepared to confront a ghost, or something far worse. The trailhead, once a place of innocent excitement, the staging ground for a school field trip meant to instill a love of nature, now felt like the entrance to a mausoleum. He remembered Ethan that morning, a blur of bright energy, his small hand slipping from his grasp as he rushed to join his classmates, his laughter echoing for a moment before the trees absorbed it. "Be good, little explorer," he'd called out, a casual farewell that had become a tormenting refrain in the long nights since. The search then had been frantic, a desperate surge of humanity combing the mountainside, park rangers, volunteers, men with dogs, helicopters thrumming overhead, their blades beating against an indifferent sky. Days bled into weeks, weeks into months. The official search was scaled back, then called off. The volunteers, their faces etched with sympathy and exhaustion, eventually returned to their own lives, their own children. But he had stayed, or rather, a part of him had remained tethered to that mountain, a spectral presence drifting through the undergrowth, listening to the wind for a whisper of his son's name. He learned the forest's rhythms, its cruel deceptions, its hidden pathways. He learned to track, to read the language of broken twigs and disturbed soil, to survive where others would perish, all in the faint, irrational hope that Ethan somehow had done the same. His wife, Ethan's mother, had shattered differently. Her grief was a storm that eventually drove her away from the mountains, from him, from the constant screaming reminder of their loss. He understood. He couldn't follow. His place was here, with the silence, with the possibility, however remote, however agonizing. The lunchbox, unearthed so close to where Ethan had last been seen, was not just a relic, it was a summons. The sketch of the cave, clutched in his trembling hand as he stood once more at the edge of that vast, indifferent wilderness, was the first tangible thread he'd been thrown in 15 years. The authorities had been sympathetic but cautious. An old find, they suggested gently, the note perhaps written by Ethan himself before he got lost, a child's game. But the father knew his son. Ethan had been meticulous, and the cave in the drawing with its specific jagged entrance felt less like a flight of fancy and more like a depiction of a real place, a destination. The initial despair after Ethan vanished had been a physical weight, crushing the air from his lungs, stealing the light from the world. For months, he'd existed in a fog of raw anguish, fueled by adrenaline and the desperate hope that the next call, the next searcher emerging from the tree line, would bring news. He'd pored over maps with shaking hands, his voice hoarse from shouting Ethan's name until the mountainside seemed to swallow it without reply. The faces of the other parents, their children safely accounted for, had been a particular kind of torture, their averted eyes, their pitying glances. He remembered the small abandoned items found during those first weeks, a dropped mitten, a brightly colored leaf Ethan had tucked into his pocket, each one a tiny, sharp knife twisting in the wound. Then, as the official search waned and the terrible silence of true loss began to settle, something within him shifted. It wasn't acceptance, not then, not ever. It was a hardening, a channeling of the all-consuming grief into a singular, obsessive purpose. If Ethan was out there, lost, hurt, he would need someone who understood the wilderness, someone who could survive it, someone who wouldn't give up. So, he became that person. He devoured books on survival, on tracking, on botany, on the geology of the Smokies. He spent weeks, then months, living off the land, pushing his own limits, learning to read the subtle signs the forest offered to those patient enough, desperate enough, to see them. The locals, initially concerned, grew accustomed to the haunted figure who roamed the backcountry, a man who seemed more spirit than flesh, driven by a grief so profound it had become a kind of strength. The discovery of the lunchbox, 15 years later, was like a lightning strike to this carefully constructed existence. The note, still here, was an impossible variable thrown into an equation he thought had only one tragic solution. Could it be? Could Ethan have survived, somehow, for some period? Or was this a clue left by someone else, someone connected to his son's disappearance? the cave sketch was his focus. He remembered Ethan's fascination with a local legend, a tale whispered among the older kids about a hidden network of caves deep in the park, a place forbidden and dangerous. Had Ethan, in his childish adventurousness, sought it out, or been led there? The authorities, while agreeing to reopen the case file, logged the lunchbox as evidence in a cold case, the note a poignant but ultimately inconclusive artifact from the past. They spoke of decomposition rates, of the unlikelihood of the note's survival, of the slim chance it meant what he desperately wanted it to mean. But the father, looking at the crayon lines, the specific way Ethan always drew jagged rocks, felt a conviction that chilled him to the bone. This wasn't just a drawing, it was a map. He spread the sketch out on the rough-hewn table in his small, isolated cabin, a place that had become both refuge and prison. The crayon strokes were thick, the colors primary, yet there was a distinctiveness to the rendering of the cave entrance, a triangular overhang, a cluster of what looked like fallen boulders to one side. He cross-referenced it with old geological surveys of the park, with hikers' anecdotal accounts of unexplored areas, his mind a whirl of possibilities. Still here, the phrase echoed, twisted. If Ethan wrote it, when, in the first few days, a hopeful plea, or later, a desperate affirmation of existence against encroaching despair, and if not, Ethan, who, and why? The thought that someone else had been involved, someone who might have taken Ethan, was an old fear, one that had gnawed at him in the darkest hours, when the image of his son simply wandering off and succumbing to the elements became too unbearable. But there had never been evidence, no ransom note, no witnesses reporting anything suspicious, just the silence and the trees. He recalled conversations with Ethan, fragments of a childhood now frozen in time. Ethan had been a collector of secrets, a lover of hidden things. Had he stumbled upon something he shouldn't have? Or someone? The local rangers were polite, offered to rescan the area where the lunchbox was found, but their eyes held a familiar weariness. The look of men who had seen too much hope fade into the harsh reality of the mountains. He couldn't blame them. 15 years was a chasm, a void that swallowed logic and reason. But for him, the father, that chasm was now illuminated by this single flickering spark. He had to go himself. His survival skills were not just a coping mechanism anymore. They were tools for a purpose he hadn't dared to articulate until now. He wouldn't be searching for a lost little boy this time. He would be tracking a survivor, or a captor, or the truth, however monstrous it might be. The note was the key, the sketch, the door. He packed methodically: rope, a climbing harness, high-lumen flashlights, water purification tablets, enough dried food for weeks. He also packed the small, worn teddy bear Ethan had slept with every night, its button eyes seeming to watch him with a silent, mournful understanding. You think this is a ghost you are chasing, don't you? You think this will break you all over again, perhaps. But the not knowing, that had been a slow death. This was a chance, however slim, for a different kind of ending. The alternative, to leave that note, that sketch, uninvestigated, was unthinkable. It would be a betrayal of Ethan, and a betrayal of the man he had become in his son's enduring absence. He stood at the precise spot marked by a small orange flag, where the hobbyist detector had screamed its discovery. The earth was still disturbed, a shallow depression testifying to the lunchbox's long interment. From here, there were no obvious trails, only the dense, indifferent forest stretching in every direction, a labyrinth of shadow and green. The father knelt, his calloused fingers brushing the soil, sifting through the leaf litter. He wasn't looking for footprints. 15 years of rain and snow and falling debris would have erased any trace of a child's passage. He was looking for something else, something more permanent, something that might have been deliberately left or unconsciously created. He remembered teaching Ethan simple trail markers, Boy Scout tricks, a small stack of stones, a subtly broken branch pointing a direction, a scratch on a tree trunk. Childish things, easily overlooked, easily dismissed as natural occurrences by anyone not specifically looking for them. Or, he thought with a cold dread, perhaps signs left by someone else, someone guiding or luring. He began to move in slow, concentric circles, his eyes scanning every tree trunk, every rock face, his senses preternaturally alert. The forest was alive with sounds, the cheer of cicadas, the rustle of unseen creatures in the undergrowth, the sigh of the wind through the canopy, but he listened for a different kind of signal, a silence that might indicate a hidden path, a disturbance in the natural pattern. Hours passed. The sun climbed, dappling the forest floor, then began its slow descent, casting long, eerie shadows. Doubt, a cold serpent, began to coil in his stomach. Was this futile? Was he chasing the desperate phantoms of his own grief, conjured by a child's drawing and two ambiguous words? Then he saw it. On the rough bark of an ancient oak, almost hidden by a curtain of ivy, was a small, deeply etched symbol, no bigger than his thumb. It wasn't a letter, not a number, but a crude spiral, barely discernible from the natural whorls of the wood. It was weathered, the edges softened by years of exposure, but it was undeniably man-made. His heart hammered against his ribs. He'd seen that spiral before. Ethan used to draw it endlessly on his notepads. A little symbol, he said, was for his secret club, a club of one. Could it be, after all this time? He looked around, his gaze sweeping the surrounding trees with a new intensity. And there, on another tree, further into the dense woods, almost invisible unless you knew exactly what to look for and where, was another spiral, a path. Faint, almost erased by time, but a path nonetheless. The spirals were his compass now, leading him deeper into a part of the national park that was rarely, if ever, traversed. The terrain grew increasingly difficult, the forest floor a treacherous tangle of roots and rocks, the undergrowth thick and resistant, tearing at his clothes, scratching his skin. Each marking was a small victory, a confirmation that he was not merely wandering, but following. Days blurred into a relentless cycle of searching, finding, and pushing onward. He moved with a grim determination, fueled by a mixture of burgeoning, terrifying hope and a profound visceral dread. What would he find at the end of this spectral trail? Ethan, alive, miraculously sustained in some hidden sanctuary, or something else, a truth far darker than the simple tragedy of a child lost to the elements. The forest seemed to close in around him, ancient trees forming a dense canopy that filtered the sunlight into an eternal twilight. The silence here was different, deeper, more profound, as if the woods themselves were holding their breath, guarding a terrible secret. He thought of Ethan, small and alone, navigating this wilderness. Did he make these marks in fear, in desperation, or with a child's brave sense of adventure, hoping to be found, or perhaps hoping to find his way back? Or was he led, his small hand in another's, these spirals, a game, a breadcrumb trail, to an unknown, sinister destination? He found other signs too, almost imperceptible disturbances, a rock unnaturally placed, a pattern of broken twigs that spoke of passage. Someone had known this route, someone had used it. The loneliness of the quest was immense, a crushing weight. There was no one to share the small triumphs, the gnawing uncertainties, only the silent, watching trees and the ghosts of his own past. He talked to Ethan sometimes in hushed whispers that the wind seemed to carry away. "Are you here, son? Are you waiting?" The question hung in the damp air, unanswered. He ate sparingly, slept little, his body running on reserves of adrenaline and a willpower forged over 15 years of unresolved grief. He was an extension of the wilderness now, his senses sharpened to an almost animalistic acuity. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig, every shift in the wind, registered and analyzed. He was close. He could feel it. The air grew heavier, colder, and a faint, almost subliminal scent of damp earth, and something else, something metallic and unsettling, began to drift through the trees. The markings became more frequent, less weathered, as if their creator had been more certain of their path here, or more desperate. The ground began to slope sharply downwards, the trees thinning to reveal a steep, rock-strewn incline that plunged into shadow. He had to use his hands to steady himself, dislodging loose stones that clattered into the unseen depths below. Then, abruptly, the earth fell away before him. A ravine, narrow and deep, a jagged scar in the mountainside, concealed by a dense overhang of rhododendrons and tangled vines. It was a place one could easily miss, a place one could stumble into and never be found. His heart pounded. This had to be it. The air rising from the ravine was noticeably cooler, carrying that faint, disturbing odor more strongly now, damp stone, decaying vegetation, and that other, sharper note he couldn't quite place. Carefully, painstakingly, he began his descent, testing each handhold, each foothold, the silence of the chasm amplifying the sound of his own breathing, the scrape of his boots on rock. As he neared the bottom, the light faded almost completely, the narrow strip of sky above a distant, pale ribbon, and then he saw them, the first signs of habitation. A crude fire pit, the stones blackened, the ashes within cold gray but not ancient, perhaps only weeks or months old. His breath hitched. Near the fire pit, scratched into the smooth, dark surface of the ravine wall, were drawings, rock drawings, primitive, childlike in their execution, yet undeniably human. Some depicted animals, deer, bears, birds, figures of the forest. Others were more abstract, unsettling. And among them, repeated several times, was the spiral, Ethan's spiral. But these drawings were more numerous, more complex than the simple sketch found in the lunchbox. Some seemed to tell a story, a desperate, fragmented narrative he couldn't yet decipher. There were stick figures, one larger, one smaller. There were depictions of the sun, and then of darkness. And there, unmistakably, was a crude rendering of a cave entrance, jagged and dark, just like the one in Ethan's drawing, but here it was shown with lines radiating from it, as if it were a source of something, or a destination of great import. He found makeshift tools, sharpened stones, branches bound with vine, a crudely fashioned bowl. Someone had lived here. Someone had survived here, or been kept here. The silence of the ravine pressed in, heavy, expectant. He felt a profound sense of trespass, of stepping into a forgotten, secret world. Still here, the words from the note resonated with a new, terrifying clarity. It wasn't just a message, it was a statement of fact. He followed the inner wall of the ravine, his flashlight beam cutting a swath through the oppressive gloom, until he saw it, a dark opening in the rock, partially concealed by a curtain of moss and hanging ferns. It was a cave, its mouth low and wide, precisely as depicted in Ethan's sketch and in the rock drawings. The metallic, unsettling scent was stronger here, mixed with the musty odor of confined, uncirculating air. This was it. The heart of the mystery, the place that had haunted his son's imagination, and now his own. He took a deep breath, the cold air filling his lungs, and stepped inside. The beam of his flashlight danced over damp stone walls, revealing a narrow passage that sloped gently downwards. The silence was absolute, save for the drip of water from unseen stalactites and the frantic thumping of his own heart. Deeper he went, the passage twisting, turning, opening into small chambers. In one, he found tattered remnants of cloth, faded and worn, snagged on a sharp projection of rock. He recognized the pattern, a faint plaid. Part of Ethan's shirt, the one he'd been wearing that day. A wave of nausea and an almost unbearable sorrow washed over him. He was so close, his son had been here. He pressed on, driven by a desperate need to know the whole truth, however terrible. And then he saw the bones. At first, scattered near the remains of another, older fire pit, he saw animal bones, deer, rabbit, squirrel, cracked open for marrow, discarded, evidence of survival, of hunting. But as his light swept further into the chamber, a larger, more shadowed alcove at the back, he saw other bones, smaller, more delicate, some, horrifyingly, unmistakably human. His blood ran cold. A femur, too small to be an adult's. Ribs, slender and brittle. A scattering of vertebrae. Were these Ethan's? The thought was a physical blow, stealing his breath, buckling his knees. He sank to the cave floor, the flashlight clattering beside him, plunging him into near darkness before he fumbled for it, his hand shaking violently. Not all animal. The phrase from the initial report on the ravine echoed in his mind. Not all animal. He scanned the shadowed corners, the beam trembling. There were more, and then, a chilling realization. The bones were not all of one size. Some were clearly those of a child. Others seemed older, though still small, perhaps adolescent. Had Ethan not been alone? Or had he survived for a time, grown, only to... The implications were too horrific to fully grasp. The note, "Still here," mocked him from the darkness. Still here, yes, but how? And for how long? And with whom? He forced himself to rise, to continue, though every instinct screamed at him to flee, to escape this subterranean tomb. There had to be more. The full story was still hidden in these oppressive shadows. He ventured deeper, into what seemed to be the cave's core, a larger chamber where the air was thick and still. Here, the signs of habitation were more established, more permanent, if such a word could apply to so grim a dwelling. A sleeping pallet of dried leaves and moss, surprisingly thick, lay in one corner. And on a flat ledge of rock, like a makeshift desk, he found them, more drawings, but these were on pieces of stripped bark, drawn with charcoal from the fire. They were more detailed, more disturbing. They depicted the larger stick figure and the smaller one, but now the larger figure was often menacing, its arms outstretched, its form distorted. And there were other figures, shadowy, indistinct, lurking at the edges. Then he saw it. A small, crudely bound collection of these bark drawings, almost like a journal. He picked it up with trembling hands. Page after page depicted scenes of life in the cave, in the ravine, hunting, foraging, but also fear, confinement. The smaller figure was often shown looking out of the cave entrance, towards a distant sun. And then, the final pages. The drawings became frantic, chaotic. The larger figure was shown falling or injured. The smaller figure was alone, looking terrified. And on the very last piece of bark, a single shaky word, scratched with desperate effort, "free." His mind reeled. Ethan had been taken, kept here, in this sunless world, by someone. For years. The "still here" note, he now realized, must have been written early on, perhaps by Ethan, a desperate cry for help left in the lunchbox, a hope that it might be found. Or perhaps it had been written by the captor, a cruel taunt, if they'd somehow known the lunchbox might be discovered. But the drawings, this harrowing chronicle on bark, told a story of survival, of endurance, and finally perhaps of a desperate, solitary escape, or a different kind of ending. The captor, the larger figure, had something happened to them? An accident? Illness? And Ethan? What did free mean? Free to leave, or free from suffering? The bones, were they all Ethan's? marking different stages of his stolen childhood? Or were some the captor's, and others his son, finally succumbing after his captor was gone? The ambiguity was a fresh torment. He searched the chamber, his light falling on a small carved wooden bird, crude but recognizably a robin, Ethan's favorite. He'd carved birds like that constantly. This was Ethan's. He had been here. He had lived here in this nightmare. For how long? The drawing suggested years. Years stolen. Years of unimaginable loneliness and fear. The truth, when it finally solidified, was a thing of quiet, devastating horror. Among the jumbled bones in the shadowed alcove, he found it, a small, tarnished silver chain, almost hidden beneath a shard of rock. On it, a single charm, a tiny, intricately carved wolf, its head thrown back in a silent howl. His own father, Ethan's grandfather, had given it to Ethan on his 6th birthday. "For the little wolf in our family," he'd said, ruffling Ethan's hair. Ethan had never taken it off. Its presence here, amidst these grim remains, was irrefutable. These were Ethan's bones. His son had not simply wandered off and perished quickly from the elements. He had been taken, kept, and had died here in this cold, dark prison, after an unimaginable ordeal. The "free" on the bark drawing was not a cry of liberation, but perhaps a final, exhausted epitaph. Or maybe, just maybe, it marked the moment his captor had died, leaving Ethan alone, too weak, too traumatized, or too lost in this subterranean world to find his way out. The other, slightly larger, older-looking bones scattered nearby might belong to that unknown captor, a recluse, a monster who had stolen his son and then, perhaps, met their own end in this desolate place. The exact timeline, the full narrative of those lost 15 years, would forever remain shrouded in the shadows of the cave, pieced together from crayon sketches, charcoal drawings, and the silent testimony of bones. He sat there for a long time, the father, in the cold, damp darkness, the small silver wolf charm clutched in his hand, its metal cool against his palm. The grief was different now. The aching void of not knowing had been replaced by the sharp, unbearable certainty of this. The survivalist, the man who had learned to read the wilderness, had finally found what he was looking for, and it was a truth that offered no comfort, only a terrible, tragic closure. Still here. Ethan had been still here all this time, so close, yet so impossibly far, living a life stolen from him, a life the father could only now begin to glimpse in its heartbreaking, terrifying fragments. He carefully gathered the small carved robin, the silver chain, and a few of the charcoal drawings on bark, tokens of a lost childhood, a testament to an unbreakable spirit that had endured in the face of unimaginable darkness. He would not leave his son here, not entirely. Emerging from the ravine back into the filtered sunlight felt like being reborn into a world that was irrevocably changed. The trees, the mountains, the sky, they were the same, yet entirely different, now imbued with the silent, sorrowful knowledge of what they had hidden for so long. He knew there would be investigations, questions, the machinery of the outside world grinding into motion. But for him, the search was over. He had found Ethan. Not the laughing, vibrant boy he had lost, but the ghost of that boy, and the undeniable proof of his stolen years. There would be no reunion, no embrace, only this heavy, heartbreaking certainty. As he walked away from that hidden place, the forest seemed to sigh around him, a mournful exhalation. He carried his grief not as a crushing weight anymore, but as a part of him, a testament to a love that had endured beyond hope, beyond reason, into the very heart of darkness, and had, in the end, found its tragic, unwavering truth. The peace he felt was not the peace of solace, but the stark, desolate peace of an answer finally given, an ending finally written, however brutal, however cruel. The mountain had kept its secret, and now, it had reluctantly, tragically, let it go.